welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omer. Now, as Bangladesh prepares for its general elections at the end of this month, almost 2,000 party workers from Bangladesh's leading opposition party are arrested over allegedly false and trumped-up charges. Now, this comes as another blow to the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, which is seeking to unseat Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of the Awami League on December 30th. Now, BNP leader Khaleda has been jailed also for corruption and barred from running against arch-rival Hasina, who is seeking a third consecutive term. To find out more what the elections hold for the Bangladeshi people, we are joined today by our guests here in the studio. I would like to welcome Mr. Abdul Ghaffar Aziz. Thank you so much for joining here. And also on the phone from Dhaka, we have Mr. Masood Karim, a journalist. Let me start with you, Mr. Masood. What is the feeling like on the streets in Bangladesh right now as they prepare for the general elections?
In a crucial stage, you know that yesterday all the candidates have taken their symbols and withdrawal time has finished. Now both of our Malik and BNP, they are started the campaign. Today's campaign has taken off. So every candidate of the 300 constituency, they have won their own constituency, and they have started their campaign with their symbol and their supporter, and it is a very, very festive mood. And also there are some concern and also tension if there is any violence, but there is, so far it is okay and there is no problem. Both of the parties ruling Awami League and the opposition BNP, they have started their campaign. So it is a very, very crucial moment ahead of the election, December 30.
Okay, now let me ask you, Mr. Abdul Ghaffar, you are the Director of Foreign Affairs for Jamaat-e-Islami. Jamaat-e-Islami party is also has been always played historically a crucial role in Bangladesh. Now, as we prepare for elections and as Mr. Masood has said, campaigning has begun there, how do you feel Jamaat-e-Islami stands, Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh, in these upcoming elections?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I must thank you and your channel that you are discussing this important issue in Pakistan, while the other media channels, they are busy in petty domestic, and a lot of unnecessary topics are discussed, but not this Bangladesh issue, which is very important for the region. Of course, history is awful. And first of all, always, I must clarify that Jamaat-e-Islami Pakistan and Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh, there are no any organizational links or ties. They are independent political party there, and they were striving for the betterment of Bangladesh and their people. But of course, we are one nation, we are one Muslim Ummah. This is why, and because the Pakistan is one of the major issues raised by ruling Awami Party there. And there is a huge propaganda against Pakistan. Even today's newspaper, if you watch the Indian newspaper Assam News, they blamed leadership of BNP, not Jamaat-e-Islami, leadership of BNP, that Tariq, son of Khalida, he met with chief of Ayza in London, and the BNP leaders, they met Pakistani diplomats in Dhaka, and Pakistan is the real face of this election is that this is an Indian-run election. They are completely controlling the policies in Bangladesh, starting from the first turn of Hasina, and especially the last election of 5th January of 2014, when the turnout was less than 5%. All the major parties, they boycotted, and the more than 50% of candidates of Awami League, they won election without any opponent candidate there. So its background is there, and these propagandas are there, and there are fears inside the country that the pre-rigging or pre-poll rigging is always started. When you referred, thousands of workers from BNP and other political parties have been arrested just few days, and most of them, they have been barred to go to the election commission to present their nomination papers. And the concerns all over the world is that how this election will go. when
Let's
this
ask
is the
Mr. Masood. Let's ask Mr. Masood. He's a journalist in Dhaka, and as he sees campaigning begin over there, Mr. Masood, these 2,000 workers who have been arrested are connected to the BNP, and in these coming weeks, we've seen them being arrested. Their leader in the incumbent party, his biggest rival, Khalid Zia, has been declared ineligible to contest these elections also on corruption charges. What is the view on the street of how the Awami League government is trying to rig the elections, or do the people still feel that this is going to be a competitive and maybe a fair election?
No, I am not aware about any mass arrest in Bangladesh in recent times. There is no arrest of political motivation. And now, after starting the election process,
I'm sorry, are you saying that you have not, are you saying that you refute the claim that 2,000 BNP workers have been arrested in the past week?
It's not correct that this moment 2,000 or any number of BNP or any political party.
BNP has come out and said it itself that over 1,900 political workers, grassroots campaigners have been arrested on various claims.
Who said? I am in Dhaka now, and I know in our newspaper, I am the chief reporter of Daily Jugant newspaper and other newspaper. No newspaper has published any news of a single activist of BNP or anybody. After starting the election process, everything is under election commission, and government and the Home Ministry has asked all the police officials, no political motivated arrest. They should not go for a new arrest for political motivation. But if there is any specific crime or criminal or regular incident, there will be arrest. But there is no mass arrest or political arrest at this moment in Bangladesh. And what he said that there is what the Jamaati leaders, Jamaati spokesperson said that there is a very fear or concern across the country. No, the country is actually in festive mode. Both of the party, they have started their campaign in a festive mode without any violence, anything. Everybody has gone to their constituency, and there is no news of any violence. So we are getting the news that everybody is going to the door-to-door. They have started campaign with their symbol, our Malik with boat and the BNP with shape of petty. So they have gone to, the election has started in a festive mode.
So what is your view on the, sorry to cut you here, but what is your view on the Bangladesh's telecoms regulator when they shut down dozens of websites, and including many news websites right before campaigning has started and elections are going to happen soon, citing different kind of reasons like security concerns? What's your take on that?
It is under the instruction of election commission. Election is scrutinizing everything. Anything will speculation or what is lead to a violence. So if there any site has given the news like what you said, the 2,000 or 3,000 people have been arrested, no. If they give this is the wrong information. No mass arrest or no any political arrest at this moment. Everybody, even the BNP party, they have given the whole 300 constituency, BNP and their alliance has given their candidate, and they are also started the campaign. And our election, this time election in December 30, it will be the historical election. That the first time both of the major parties, our Malik and the BNP, they have participated in the election under a government. It is not caretaker government or interim.
But let me ask you this. Let me ask you this, Mr. Masood, that the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has constantly and over time come under criticism, not just by people within Bangladesh, but especially international agencies on curbing press freedom. Now, as a journalist reporting on the ground, where do you stand on this? Because you can't really say that all the international papers reporting on this, and we have visuals running on our screen right now, are incorrect, all of them, or biased in saying that there has been a lot of curbing of press freedom in Bangladesh.
Generally, there is no carving of press freedom. Our newspaper, we are writing everything. Our television are criticizing the government. No problem. But definitely in a country like Bangladesh for a long time, there are some rules and regulations which sometimes have happened, sometimes violence happen. But ahead of the election, there is no curb of press freedom. Our newspaper are criticizing always. We are publishing the opposition campaign. We are publishing the ruling party's campaign. We are giving the all types of news. No problem at this moment. But in a general sense, it is not only the Sheikh Hasina's government, but every government sometimes we have the concern because of the rules and regulations we have for curbing. We have the public secrecy, for example, Public Secrecy Act, which can curb control the media. This law for every government, even the BNP government. BNP has these laws, and BNP is participating in the election. They are not have any commitment that they will withdraw this law. So it is not for the Sheikh Hasina government the curbing the press freedom. The curbing press freedom in a general sense, we have little concern. We have concern about our freedom of expression, but not by government, Sheikh Hasina or Sheikh Khaleda Zia, no. In a general sense, there are some concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Masood Karim, for your update on what is happening in Dhaka. Coming back to you, Mr. Abdul Ghaffar, if you were to talk about a trend evolving in Bangladesh politics in terms of religious parties taking a lead, how do you see that trend evolving, especially in these coming elections?
Before answering your question, I just refer to a small news item saying that U.S. lawmakers places resolution on Bangladesh elections. And they show their concern and fears that the elections are controlled by some authorities inside and outside the country. And a Republican lawmaker has placed a resolution before the Congress asking the U.S. government to promote free, fair, transparent, and credible elections in Bangladesh. These fears are there. And even the Chinese ambassador, he also shown his concerns about these elections. And of course, as an ambassador, he can hope that the election will go well and smooth.
Right.
But these concerns are there from China, from America, European Union. They refuse to send their observers to this election.
Well, this year they have declared that they will be sending teams as independent observers in Bangladesh.
They said that we will observe, but they are not sending their observers there in Bangladesh. If you see all these propaganda items from government, and just yesterday, the Secretary General of BNP, he declared that hundreds of fake accounts on social media registered just to have this campaign against opposition parties, and also blaming Pakistan again. I don't know why they are attacking Pakistani High Commission before the elections. The indifferences and their own differences are there. Even if you see Hussein Irshad, he fled to Singapore this morning because of these elections and the differences between the ruling alliance. But because of Jamaat-e-Islami leadership, most of them have been hanged by some political decisions of Bangladeshi courts. The same Chief Justice who was leading that judicial team, now he is also...
Let me welcome our new guest here, joining us from Dhaka also. He's a political analyst, Mr. Rafiqul Islam. Thank you so much for joining us here on Newswire. Let me ask you this. Now, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina refuses to meet the opposition's demands for fair elections, as they're calling it. The opposition, that is basically some of the demands entail that releasing opponent candidates from jail ahead of the elections, and they also include dissolving parliament and forming a neutral caretaker government. Now, where does this stand now, as campaigning has started in Dhaka?
You know that the BNP and its two alliances, Jatiyo Oko Front and 20-party alliance, decided to take part in the election as part of their movement, despite having an adverse situation, though any of their demands were not met by the government. You know, our High Court bench today gave a split judgment over the acceptance of Khaledia's nomination. Senior judge of the bench asked the election commission to accept the nomination of Khaleda Zia, but the junior judge of the two-member bench, however, rejected her writ petition. Now, the petition will go to the Chief Justice, and he will form another bench, and Khaleda Zia will have to wait for the judgment of the third bench.
So the timing could not be worse. This will not get through before the general elections start, or will it?
Yeah, it will be too late. But if the High Court gives judgment in favor of her, he will be able to take part in the election, because election commission is bound to obey the High Court rule.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Dhaka. Coming back to you, Mr. Kafar, if you were to comment on how BNP has changed its stance, especially given earlier, historically, they had an alliance with the Islamist parties, there was Jamaat-e-Islami, and recently, of late, they dropped that alliance for smaller, more secular parties. What do you think changed in their stance?
No, I think they have, they took other political parties also on board. Jamaat-e-Islami and the 20-party alliance, they are together with the BNP, and now Dr. Kamal Hussain and some small parties, they also join. And there are national figures joining this opposition alliance. So the grounds are stronger for opposition parties. And if there is a real election in Bangladesh, so whole scenario will be changed and different than the present one. But BNP, because of their leadership, is in prison or either outside the country. So they are facing these challenges. Even the other opposition leaders, some of them based in US and other European countries, joining hand with BNP, but they are not on ground. So, and hundreds of their political workers and also workers of Jamaat-e-Islami and district level leadership, they have been arrested just within a week. So these are the challenges. But 20-party alliance and BNP-led opposition parties, they are striving to have a real election this time, because in last election when they boycotted, everybody was claiming and he was hoping that the international community will ask Awami League to have a real representation in the parliament and maybe new elections or any arrangement inside the country.
Well, what do you think?
But at this point, we must refer that the fears of deadly clashes between the people and the opposition and ruling parties are there. And these are the reports of official intelligence agencies.
Right.
No,
and
intelligence agencies of the government. So if they are spreading these news, so it means that they may have some plans as well to pull this and to take these elections as they designed with their international partners, especially from India. And I just
let me quickly pull in our fourth guest for this session. Mr. Brigadier Nadeel is joining us from Islamabad. Here he's a political analyst, and I would like to have your views on the elections coming up, the general elections in Bangladesh, especially as we see Awami Party taking head-on BNP, and in light of those arrests that have just taken place of activists of the BNP. How do you feel these elections are going to fare this time?
Bangladesh history, as far as the elections are concerned, is known to everybody. Basically, since 1971, when East Pakistan was forcibly occupied by India and then later converted into Bangladesh, India has been playing a dominant role in Bangladeshi politics. This is first. Secondly, within Bangladesh, the Awami League, the party, as you know, because of their old affiliation with India, and have been going along, and the policies have been tailored accordingly. Whereas the others have been objecting or deviating from the this kind of pro-India stance or this Indian hegemony or Indian control. So now, once people are being arrested, once they're being marginalized, an environment is being created whereby the elections results are predetermined by, let's say, weakening the other side. And so the aim of this whole activity could be to ensure that a political victory falls into the lap of the Awami League. And the policies, basically, it's the geopolitics behind this, besides the local politics, which both combined to create the environment which is happening right now.
Mm-hmm. And now, the rivalry between Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and what we've seen with Khaleda Zia has been not just, it seems, vengeful, but very poisonous over these past 2-3 decades. Now, in terms of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's foreign policy, especially concerning Pakistan, do you feel that she has been tilting towards India more so?
Obviously, you know the history. I mean, we all know the history. As far as this lady Hasina is concerned, she's the only daughter of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, or the only child who survived. You know, there was a coup in Bangladesh in which the entire family virtually was gunned down, including the founder, that's Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Mm-hmm. And they've been pursuing an India policy from day one. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's history now. Everybody knows it. And on the other side, the legacy of Zia and the followers and his family, they're on the opposite. They're on the opposite side. I mean, which doesn't mean that they are not Bangladeshis. They're both Bangladeshis. But let's put it this way: that they follow a more independent policy. They follow a policy more tailored towards Bangladesh's own independence, its sovereignty, and its betterment, rather than taking orders from Delhi.
Okay. All right. Well, that's under all the time we have right now. Mr. Brigadier Nadeel, thank you so much for joining us. And Mr. Abdul Ghaffar, thank you so much for joining us here on Newswire. We're going to take a quick short break and be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. Now, Gaza's health ministry has carried out 94 amputations on Palestinians since protests began in March this year. Out of these 94 amputations, 82 involve lower limbs. It has been more than 9 months since the Great March of Return has started, where thousands of Palestinians have taken to the streets in peaceful protest in Gaza, now marking the catastrophe when 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly removed from their homes and villages to clear way for Israel's establishment in 1948. We are going to be discussing how this vicious cycle of events where Israeli forces and Palestinian protesters come head-to-head, creating more and more injuries amongst either side of the fence. Joined here today in the studios, we have Professor Eugene Kontrovich. He's a professor of international law and director of international law at the Jerusalem-based Kohelet Policy Forum in Israel. And also from Istanbul, we have Mr. Hassan bin Imran, a political analyst who will be joining the discussion. Professor Eugene, I would like to start with you, what your view is on the number of amputations that have gone up as reported by Gaza's health ministry.
First of all, I think the Gazan health ministry is not necessarily the most reliable source. They have in the past issued numbers of fatalities, reported fatalities, which they've had to revise. Of course, it is quite likely that there are people who are being injured, because what you described as peaceful protests are really a forcible attempt to break into Israel, to cross the border, and as Hamas has itself said, reconquer Jerusalem.
So what is Israeli forces when they're defending the border? What is their biggest concern in terms of the protesters? What kind of ammunitions are they defending themselves from when they're talking about protesters, armed resistance or attacks across the fence?
So most of the protesters are human shields for a smaller number who use Molotov cocktails, who occasionally shoot live ammunition, who launch kite bombs. They tie flammable materials and Molotov cocktails to kites and fly them across the border, often making them particularly attractive and colorful so that little children will pick them up and be injured. And of course, Hamas continues to try to breach the fence and send in fighters to tunnel under the fence. And just yesterday, Hamas celebrated a shooting incident in which 7 Israelis were wounded, including a pregnant woman whose baby had to be delivered prematurely. Both of their lives are currently in danger. Hamas said it was a heroic operation. So that's who you're dealing with in Gaza, and that's their clear intention.
And we've continuously seen all previous attempts historically not having resolved this issue. And as resistance increases on either side and attacks go on, innocent civilians get injured. Even as you mentioned about the pregnant woman and had to deliver prematurely. So what exactly is the solution in the region to stop this once and for all?
Well, for a long time, people said that the problem was the presence of Jews living in Palestinian areas, in areas with with a majority Palestinian population. So Israel accepted that viewpoint and took out every single Jew, every single Jewish settler from Gaza. They took out the graves, they took out the houses, they took out every single soldier and every single civilian and left the Palestinians to themselves. So if the problem was the presence of Jews, the so-called occupation, then you'd think you'd have peace. Instead, that's what brought Hamas to power. So I think the only solution going forward is one that has to understand you cannot have an area free of Jews. That's not a legitimate political ambition for the Palestinians. That's not something Israel should be forced to accept. But like many conflicts in the world, like the Indo-Pakistani conflict, which is just about as old, the fact that there's a conflict doesn't mean that there's a solution.
Right. Now, let me pull you in, Mr. Hassan. Could you give me your view on this ongoing conflict as it continues? A whole generation of Palestinians are left now maimed for life. A claim that our guest is saying is contestable because Gaza Health Ministry doesn't give very accurate figures. But what about MSF? They have, let me read out the MSF mission in Palestine, what they've said, that these injuries that we see are characterized by a high prevalence of open fractures, mostly below the knee, with massive tissue loss and damage to veins and nerves. Now, what is your take on it, first of all? How credible are these reports, especially from independent organizations operating there in clinics and hospitals trying to help the injured?
Thank you so much, first of all. But before I comment on that, I kind of get a little bit surprised from the comments of your guest. So basically, he wants us to believe, and he wants to sell the idea that these peaceful demonstrations, carrying, in the worst case scenario, carrying a stone, trying to ask to break up the siege that has been there since 10 years ago, the illegal siege that has been condemned by by the international community, has been condemned by the United Nations many times. So he wants us to believe that these peaceful demonstrators trying to get the basic rights, and I'm not talking about civil or political rights, I'm talking about the right to food, the right to electricity, the right to education, the right to travel, the right of movement, all the basic rights enlisted in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And yesterday it was the Human Rights Day. So Israel wants us to believe, and your guest wants to advocate, that these peaceful demonstrators are terrorists and they are covering up for whatsoever. Okay, I would like to see the views of your guest on the fact that Hamas existed only 20 or 30 years ago. Before that, there was no Hamas. There was nothing like Hamas in Palestine. But the Israeli atrocities were there. Hundreds of thousands were injured. Hundreds of thousands were put into jail. Palestine was eaten up. West Bank was eaten up by settlements. Jerusalem was annexed. Golan Heights were occupied. All of this happened before Hamas even saw the light.
Professor Eugene, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, certainly. Hamas is a relatively new political party, an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's true that there were other prior terrorist organizations like the Palestinian Liberation Organization. What's amazing is that it's only when Israel withdrew from Gaza, when Israel said, we will have no more Jews living in this area, we're giving you a Jew-free zone, which is, we are ending the so-called occupation, we took out the tanks, and it's only then that Hamas came to power, which suggests that the political goals here go simply beyond taking Jews out of particular places and taking Jews out of the entire region.
But it doesn't really address the main problem, which is the debate over whether the land belonged to Palestinians and it is encroached by Jewish settlements, or that the Jewish has a birthright to be living there. It never really addressed that problem to begin with.
Well, there's actually a separate question from who the land belongs to who should be allowed to live there. There are, just because a people may have a claim of sovereignty to a territory, usually does not give them a right, at least not in a polite, civilized society, to say, this is our land and we're not going to have Jews living in it. That's an even stronger claim. But we know that this area belonged to the Ottoman Turks until 1918. Then it was part of the British Mandate. Then it was occupied by Egypt, and it was an Egyptian military occupation. And in 1967, Israel liberated it. There had been Jewish communities there before the Egyptian occupation. At no time prior to this was this a Palestinian state or a Palestinian territory. But even if Palestinians have a claim to have this territory as part of a country, it's one thing to say you have a claim to have a territory as part of your country. It's another thing to say Jews aren't allowed to live there. But indeed, that is what the Palestinians insisted on, and that's what they got. They got Israel withdrew every single Jewish citizen. Now, of course, there's a state of hostilities between Israel and the Hamas regime in Gaza. And when you have hostilities, you have blockades, which is a legitimate tool of war. Hamas, on the other hand, does not seem to want to be left alone in Gaza. They dig tunnels into Israel, they send projectiles over the border, they send missiles to attack civilian towns. So even though Israel has left Gaza, Gaza does not seem to want to leave Israel.
But then why is it that across the border, the number of casualties and those injured, there is such a huge difference in numbers? Just in the 9 months that have passed during this protest, Israeli forces have killed at least 210 Palestinians in this besieged strip of this besieged strip, and wounded more than 18,000 people. So how would you explain the difference in those injured and killed on either side of the fence?
So I find the 18,000 number very non-credible. I think the Palestinians use civilians purposefully for human shields. If civilians get wounded, it's good for the Palestinian cause. But also, a disproportionate number of casualties is not an evidence of war crimes. How many Americans have been killed or injured in operations against ISIS or operations in Syria? Zero. So it's infinitely disproportionate number of casualties between, let's say, America and Syria.
I'm curious to know.
But that does not mean that America is engaged in war crimes. And I wish the Hamas leadership would not locate their missile launchers, their bases next to schools, next to kindergartens, but that's what they do. Because
you're contesting the numbers of those killed and injured on either side of the fence, and that is something that has been an ongoing problem when reporting this conflict zone on who is the credible source of information. Here I would like to play a short video clip that kind of highlights this problem. This is about a CNN reporter, a contributor there, who spoke about this in a UN session about Palestinians' freedom, and just his choice of words lost him his job. Let's take a look.
While the Universal Declaration for Human Rights says that all people are, quote, born free and equal in dignity and rights, the Israeli nation state continues to restrict freedom and undermine equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, as well as those in the West Bank and Gaza.
Mr. Hassan, what's your take on this? On reporting Palestine, on reporting on Gaza, how do you feel that the world in general responds to the reporting coming out from the West?
Unfortunately, right now, as long as the United States is back in Israel, the whole world will be afraid of what Uncle Sam says or what the United States thinks. You think if the United States was not behind Israel, would Israel be this careless about the United Nations Security Council's resolutions, about the whole international law? How many United Nations Security Council decision has been broken by Israel? How many international law has been violated by Israel? How many hundreds, I'm not going to speak of the numbers because you just mentioned them, and you guys know the numbers are better than us. How much of this has happened, but yet there is no accountability by the international community accountability for Israel. The maximum is done towards Israel is a condemnation, and that's it. That's very understandable, seeing that the United States is led by someone like Trump, who doesn't really care about the international institutions, who's really ready to impose sanctions on anyone who opposes them.
Okay, let me ask Professor Eugene the same question about how he feels about this contributor. Mark Hill lost his job basically by the choice of his words. Do you feel that that reporting in general on Gaza and Israel and the conflict as it goes on is a little biased, or a very, very sensitive area where objective reporting has always been a problem?
I think reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is certainly biased. It's overwhelmingly biased against Israel. You see that whenever there's a Palestinian terror attack, headlines will say, Israelis shoot at Palestinian, that is to say the attacker, and then only later in the story will you see that that Palestinian had just attempted to murder Israeli civilians. In terms of Mark Lamont Hill's comments, I think it's important to say he was not reporting. He was speaking at a political conference of the United Nations. and he was essentially calling for the destruction of the state of Israel, and what would certainly come with it, the expulsion of all Jews. Aside from his controversial comment, Palestine from the river to the sea, he also specifically said that Palestinians shouldn't be criticized for using violence.
But Professor Eugene, let me ask you a basic question on freedom of press here. When somebody has used that term, river to the sea, how do you genuinely feel that it was misconstrued or blown out of proportion? And even if it was, what happens to the entire concept, especially propagated in the West a lot, especially by CNN, on freedom of press or freedom of speech? Was it really worth losing a job for?
One is what his comments mean, another is what should CNN do about it. His comments are clearly calling for the creation of a Jewish free state, a state which would have no Jews in it, like every other Arab state, in the Jewish historical homeland, an event that could only be accompanied with massive blood and violence. And that is clearly an endorsement of mass murder. What to do about it is a different question. In America today, despite the principle of free speech, private employers are increasingly under pressure and are increasingly firing anyone who says something politically incorrect or perceived to be insensitive towards any kind of minority. And as it happens, it has now been applied in this context. But it's certainly not the case that people can say whatever they want on CNN and keep their jobs. I'm not saying that's a good thing, and whether he should be fired or not is a separate question. But it should be at least acknowledged that a supposedly serious CNN journalist.
All right. Thank you, Professor Eugene and Mr. Hassan. Let me welcome our next guest, Mr. Seth Franzman, joining us here from Jerusalem as a political analyst. We were just talking about reporting on Gaza conflict, and we were talking with our previous guests about the different numbers that float up from international agencies as well as Gaza Health Ministry on the number of casualties. And then we were referring to a CNN contributor, Mark Hill, losing his job over using the wrong words when he talks about freedom for Palestinians. How do you feel about this?
You know, it's important for someone who's a commentator on a major channel such as CNN that they obviously should take time to learn both sides. And I think using very politically charged words such as saying that, you know, Israel shouldn't exist or that Palestine should be free from the river to the sea would certainly indicate that he needs to educate himself a little bit more about the conflict, and perhaps it's not his role to decide how people here in places like Tel Aviv, where I'm sitting, it's not his role to decide how they will live. At the end of the day, people here in Tel Aviv or people in Gaza, they should have the right to decide.
So what is your take on freedom of press then? Is he not allowed to express his opinion, even if he works for one of the biggest news organizations in the West?
Well, I think that he's allowed to express his opinion as much as he likes, of course. I mean, we're all allowed to express our opinions, but just like a person who is a commentator on a large channel in Pakistan or China or any country obviously has to weigh the way in which they express themselves with the audience that they're speaking to and their obligations. So obviously he can say whatever he likes. He has free speech in the United States.
One view has been that his take on it, that his words were anti-Semitic. And the other view has been that he was referring to the historical context of Palestinians living in, when he says river to the sea. Do you feel that maybe there would have been some kind of misconstruing what he was trying to say and blowing it out of proportion?
Look, it could be that it's blown out of proportion, but he was speaking at the United Nations, right? So he wasn't just speaking at a coffee shop. I don't think that what he said is necessarily anti-Semitic, but I think that he should, of course, spend time listening to the 7 million or 6.5 million Jews that live in Israel and learning the different perspectives that Jewish people have. And he should also listen to the Palestinians so that it's not just one viewpoint. I think in terms of the question of history, it's not entirely clear that there is such a thing necessarily as a historic Palestine that was free from the river to the sea in the 1930s or 40s. Palestine was a British colony, much like India and Pakistan were one time a British colony. So we have to remember that the colonizers in Britain are partly responsible for the partition that ended up as Israel and what is now Palestinian territory. So, yes, of course we should learn that history, but we should learn some of it correctly, I think.
We're joined by Dr. Mustafa from Palestine. He's a political analyst there. We're talking to our guests about the different nuances on reporting on the conflict here in Gaza. Could you give your view on how the firing of a CNN reporter, when he gave his opinion on the freedom of Palestinians in the UN session, how this reflects on how reporting is done on this region?
No, I think what has happened to the CNN correspondent or commentator, he was actually a commentator, is totally unacceptable. It shows very serious discrimination from the side of CNN, like most other major media outlets in the United States. They all practice discrimination against any person or spokesperson who reflects reality here and defends the Palestinian rights. And in my opinion, this is totally unacceptable. One thing that Israel is practicing is to try to accuse anybody who criticizes the Israeli policy of occupation and apartheid as anti-Semitism. It's not right. This is not anti-Semitism. This is criticism of violation of international law. Israel continues to occupy Palestinian land, conducting the longest occupation in modern history. Israel has created a system of racism and a much worse apartheid than what prevailed in South Africa at one point of time. And anybody who criticizes Israel, they go after him with what I can only describe as psychological terror. Anybody who criticizes Israel is accused of being anti-Semitic or is accused of being anti-Jewish, and that is totally unacceptable. Israel is not above international law. Israel cannot be allowed to be unaccountable for its violations of Palestinian human rights, and that's why this dismissal of this CNN commentator is nothing but an act of violation of his basic human rights of freedom of expression.
Mr. Said, let me ask you now, as we've spoken about reporting and how the accuracy of reporting on the conflict zone here, let me also talk a little about the Great March of Return that's been going on for the past 9 months. Now, numbers keep coming up on the casualties that we see of the Palestinians, and just in these 9 months, it's being reported that 210 Palestinians have been killed in this strip and over 18,000 people have been injured. Now, the Israeli army has always said that it's responding to weekly assaults on its frontier. Now, could you talk a little bit about the nature of the assault versus the return fire that comes from Israeli forces?
Around 9 months ago, I think in the last day of March, these large protests, some of which, or many of which are at times violent, began, and Israel warned the marchers and the protesters not to enter the security zone where the fence is, or that they would eventually face lethal force. And Israel has, as you stated, used lethal force against some of the people, I think primarily targeting people that are throwing Molotov cocktails or that Israel thinks are a danger. But a large number of people, obviously, some of whom are just civilians who are there, or civilian protesters, have been injured. And I think that if we look at the absolute numbers, it's more people than in the first 6 months or first year of the first Intifada. So it's actually a much larger story, I think, that is actually being covered. So it's a huge, huge protest that's gone on for a long time. And I don't think that Israel or Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip, seems to have a kind of solution as to what to do about it.
Dr. Mustafa, let me pull you in here. In terms of the Palestinians armed with stones and grenades and firebombs and then getting a return fire from Israeli forces, there doesn't seem to be any, this situation doesn't seem to be abating. What do you feel like could be a more effective solution to bring down the number of casualties here, to bring down both sides attacking each other?
There is a misrepresentation of the reality here, as if Palestinians are the ones who are attacking Israel. This is not true. Palestinians conducted very peaceful, non-violent marches in the Peace March which is aiming at the right of return and to break the siege on Gaza. And it was Israel that used violence in a vicious way. And if Palestinians use violence, they use it only in the form of defending themselves against Israeli attacks, like has happened recently when Israel bombarded Gaza from their airplanes and with their rockets. So it is important to see here the reality. Gaza is under siege since 2006. This siege is creating the worst kind of humanitarian crisis ever. Let me just tell you that 82% of the young population in Gaza are unemployed, and 95% of the water is polluted or salinated. When a country imposes a siege on another country, this is considered an act of war. And Israel is actually conducting an act of war. But not only that, Israel blocks all passages to Gaza. Israel prevents fishermen from fishing in the sea. If they go deeper than 6 miles into the sea, they will be shot at, and so many fishermen were shot at and killed. If Palestinians demonstrate even inside Gaza, I'm not talking about the borders, I'm talking about inside Gaza, there is a huge buffer zone which Israel imposes with military force, which is no less than 24% of this very little small 140 square miles of Gaza, and the 24% of Gaza is forbidden for Palestinians. Farmers are shot at when they go to farm, and Palestinians demonstrate in the buffer area, not at the borders. And the vast majority of the 220 people killed and the 18,000 people injured, the vast majority of them were shot and killed either in the buffer zone or even deep inside Gaza. Mm-hmm. So it is unacceptable to claim that Israel is responding to violence. It's Israel that is practicing violence and trying to deny Palestinians the right to resist occupation, which is an internationally recognized right. They want to deny us the right to resist militarily, to deny us the right to resist even peacefully, and deny the right even to resist with words. If we criticize occupation, they call it instigation. If we demonstrate peacefully, they call it violence. If we respond to their military attacks with some military reaction, they call it terrorism. The reality is that it is Israel that is practicing state terrorism against
Mr. Seth, how do you see it? Do you see the Palestinian rock throwers, the protesters, do you see them as instigating violence, or do you see them as maybe reacting to something that even David Cameron called was an open-air prison, the situation, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily an either-or question. I mean, Gaza obviously is under blockade, and for the average person in Gaza, I think, which makes up about half the people there, have been born underneath this blockade since Hamas came to power. Those average people, of course, have a good reason to protest. Now, they want to protest Israel, but they should also protest the fact that they are being controlled by Hamas, which is a terrorist organization that fires rockets at Israel. So it's not necessarily either or. I think the people there have a very good reason to protest. They have very clear demands that they should have met in terms of the fact that they can't travel abroad or they can't get many decent services. So I think that it's not such a simple story. It's not always that Israel is wrong or the average people are right. The average people in Gaza are right. I think that Hamas is wrong. I think that Israel should try to find some way in which these almost 2 million people will have some more of a future. But and the international community should probably be playing a bigger role in that. So it's,
but international reports coming out.
Yeah.
International reports coming out from Gaza, and there have been interviews done of these protesters who have acknowledged throwing stones. They've acknowledged throwing towards Israeli troops now during demonstrations. So yes, it's probably not been entirely peaceful. But as these happen, there are a lot of
actually Hamas activists. So some of the protesters are just average people. So it's where
this is where there's a conflict of opinion here, because a lot of reports coming out from the region, from independent agency, a lot of human rights agencies operating, say that lots of it is just collateral damage. I mean, there were paramedics trying to rescue those injured, getting wounded, and as a result being maimed for life because Israeli forces said they shoot for the lower limbs to restrain the protesters. And what happens as a result is what we're seeing is a lot of amputations. So as you see where I'm going with this, it seems to just sort of spur on a vicious cycle. So clearly this is...
Yes, I agree with you. It is a vicious cycle. It's not a cycle I think that any average person should have to be involved in. So it's obviously a cycle in which the international community should be helping more, and Egypt should be helping more. Israel left Gaza. I don't think Israel wants to play a role in Gaza, but I don't think Israel can accept having a terrorist organization that fires hundreds or thousands of rockets at it in Gaza. And Hamas wants to hide behind the civilians. So it's,
right.
I think that we have to remember that.
Mr. Mustafa, Dr. Mustafa, let me ask you here. Israel continues to say that it's acting proportionately, stopping border breaches by shooting to maim and not to kill. What is your take on how this problem is going to be resolved, especially in the light of not getting much international attention?
Well, first of all, I do not agree with any effort to claim that if any person is a member of Hamas, that makes him a terrorist. And Hamas represents an important part of the Palestinian structure. And Hamas and I personally had negotiations with the leaders of Hamas. And they've told me that they totally accept our approach of nonviolence, and that they will not turn to using any violent form of resistance unless they are attacked and having to defend themselves. And I believe them. And I think during the last 6 months, they tried to stick completely to nonviolent approach. And but Israel claims that our peaceful demonstrations are violence. And the problem is that the narrative that is presented in the world tends to be an Israeli narrative. Even when something is reported correctly, it is put within the framework of a narrative that is wrong. We are not occupying Israel. Israel is occupying us. Just imagine if British were occupying Israel, or if Palestinians were occupying Israel. I think everybody will be praising any act of resistance, even military resistance, from the Israeli side. But the world has to accept us as equal human beings, which are entitled to equal rights, like everybody else. And the real narrative of the situation is that Israel is occupying Palestinians, Israel is oppressing Palestinians, Israel is killing Palestinians, and Israel is practicing discrimination against Palestinians. So you cannot equate between the two sides here.
Right, and until this debate is resolved,
and the other side is oppressed. And yes, sorry, go ahead.
We've just run out of time, Dr. Mustafa. I just want to thank you here and Mr. Seth for talking to Newswire. Till or unless this debate is finally resolved and international community steps up and bringing all stakeholders to the table to resolve the conflict, the number of deaths and the number of those injured for life is going to continue to go up. That's all the time we have on Newswire. We'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.